trial of Michael Brelo, the Cleveland police officer charged with manslaughter in the shooting deaths of Melissa Williams and Timothy Russell, wrapped up this week. Russell and Williams were the occupants of a vehicle that was the subject of a high-speed chase through Cleveland, East Cleveland, Bracknell, in November 2012. They were stopped in a parking lot in East Cleveland and killed in their car by police officers who apparently believed that they were shooting back. But only Brelo was charged criminally in the case, and that trial wrapped up today before a judge. It was a bench trial, and that judge is probably going to be issuing his verdict later this month. And there are concerns about what will be the community impact either way, whether he is acquitted or he is found guilty. There were no lesser included offenses, so it's either manslaughter or nothing. So I'm Elizabeth Sullivan. I direct the opinion operation at the Northeast Ohio Media Group and also the editorial board for the Plain Dealer in the Northeast Ohio Media Group. And I'm joined in today's opinion show to talk about the Brelo trial and its implications by Kevin O'Brien, who's the deputy editorial page editor of the Plain Dealer and a noted columnist, and editorial writers Sharon Broussard, Chris Evans, and Pete Krouse. And Chris, I'm going to start with you. What are some of the takeaways of the trial? I mean, this was a rather extraordinary trial in that we don't often see into the inner workings of the Cleveland Police Department in cases like this. What's your takeaway?
One of the things that I was struck by was the fact that you have these officers who just refuse to cooperate with the prosecutor's office. And you know, we hear about the blue line and brothers protecting each other, and I think this case was a great example of that, where they just refused to cooperate. And I don't think the prosecutor really helped by not offering them the fifth, you know, protecting them, allowing them to use the fifth, because we don't know where this case is going to go. And I was, you know, and they were steadfast. They did not budge an inch on that.
So, yet there were many police officers who did testify. The primary, testimony came from police officers.
And they were,
so clearly, this is not a hard and fast blue line, right?
Well, I think with the officers that testified were given immunity. They were allowed to take the fifth. And the information that they gave was obviously pertinent, but you didn't, I don't know how many officers were subpoenaed or asked to testify, but you just did not see this parade of police officers going on.
So I don't think you can take the fifth and then testify, but at any rate, so that
immunity, I think, is
I
what
see
talking
the
about.
difference between immunity and the Fifth Amendment. There were 7 who actually did take the Fifth Amendment, plead the Fifth Amendment, refused to testify at all because of, you know.
Yeah, there could be federal
Could
charges.
be incriminate themselves.
Yeah, and I think part of their reasoning there was that the case against Brelo was such that if the judge convicts Brelo, then anybody who testified and who gave sworn testimony as far as their actions that evening, anyone who fired their gun, anyone who participated in the chase, could face charges. And the Fifth may have been a really wise, more than a tactical thing for them. It may have been just a wise course of action.
So part of the problem here is that the forensics are at some degree inconclusive, because there were 137 shots fired. I believe there was substantial evidence that Michael Brelo fired most of those, or a plurality of those.
Right.
But whether he fired the shot the killing shots, that's not clear.
Right, and there were shots fired after.
What do you think about that, Kevin?
I don't know. The whole case is odd to me in that so many police officers participated. It seemed like half the police force was involved in the chase, and then you had a whole lot of officers on the scene where the gunfire took place, many of them involved, and it almost seems as if this is a symbolic prosecution in a lot of ways. That Brelo is meant to stand for a whole group of officers who were doing pretty much the same thing, and the case boils down to whether it was somehow worse for him to perhaps stand on the hood of the car and fire down into the driver's and passengers area. I mean, I don't know that there's a criminal offense in that. I think there's some odd behavior, and one of the experts that testified for the prosecution said that that was certainly not a police procedure move, but he also said that it wasn't necessarily a culpable move either. So, if I were the judge, I'd be in a really tough spot. I don't know what I'm left with as far as expectations and maneuverability under the law. I'm not really sure that this case is a very good case just because they boiled it down to one guy.
Although, there was compelling evidence, as I mentioned, that he fired a plurality of shots. And a majority of the final shots, according to the prosecution, though I think that's an issue of fact that the judge will have to decide. But he was also a Marine in Iraq, and he did say, at least in deposition before the trial, that was his Marine training, jumping in. But didn't he have sort of a lack of memory about whether he actually got up on the hood of the car?
Yes.
Well, Marine training, I mean.
He said his Marine training was to fire from a height, and he did say
okay,
that he
but
got
what
up
was his
on
police
the-
training? I mean,
question.
clearly, I think Kevin is right. A lot of people lost their heads in this episode, and I think Brelo may have lost his head the most, and he's the one who is on trial because of that. A lot of people did not act properly, and it's hard to sort it all out. These kind of situations are always that way, but they're gonna try to convict Brelo because he does represent what was a very, very poorly carried out incident that night.
Yet the forensics were largely analyzed by state investigators, and as those findings were summarized by the Ohio Attorney General Mike DeWine, it was that the police officers genuinely felt that their lives were in threat, that they believed that the firing was in part from the car, and that was motivating them. I mean, Sharon, do you think that that aspect got sufficient attention in this trial, or that we should give that consideration in weighing Michael Brelo's the issues about Michael Brelo?
I'm of two minds of that because I think one of the defense attorneys said in today's story something along the lines of, well, then that could always be used as an excuse. I was afraid whether or not that danger was there or not. So that's troubling to me, but I do think that the optics of Brelo standing on the car is what got him into trouble. And I really feel that, going back to the DeWine report where he said that, any of those officers could have been shot by friendly fire the way that they were behaving. And that may not be a criminal matter. That might be more of, I don't know, administrative manner, about the way that they, totally botched this thing. But I'm not sure about the criminal.
That goes back
charges.
to what we editorialized about after the DeWine report came out, which is that we did agree that it represented systemic problems within the police department, and that the position of City Hall that this was reflective of individual officers' misbehavior was simply not the full picture. I mean, how would you kind of position the Brelo prosecution within that context, now that at least the city is negotiating changes with the U.S. Department of Justice?
I think I said a couple of shows ago, I do not think that he should have been charged. I mean, it's pretty clear that when you have that many officers surrounding a vehicle, that this is a systematic problem that's going on here, and that there should have been some other way to make sure that there was punishment dealt out. And then also clarity with the community about why punishments were given to different officers and how, and also, I guess, future plans about how this wouldn't happen again, as opposed to the criminal case, which I'm not going to predict, but anyway.
So, Kevin, do you think that anything good has come out of this trial, though, in the sense of it has actually, despite the fact that there were officers who chose not to testify, it has shed a lot of light on, some of the internal decision-making, how they handled this particular case. Perhaps it will, create pressure to change this, blue wall of silence to the extent that it exists.
Well,
What do you think?
some of those things may happen, and some of those things may be beneficial. I think, though, you've got to get back to the question that our justice system always needs to ask, and that is this individual charged properly, and is this individual guilty? And we will know the result of the second question soon enough. The first question is sure enough debatable. I don't think that any gain that you might get from this case systemically is worth the burden that's placed on the individual who really didn't act in a way that was particularly egregious on a very egregious event.
Okay.
Yeah.
What
And
do you
I
think
think-
about that, Chris?
Well, I think it gets back to what we've talked about before. I mean, the difficulty in this case is proving that Brelo did in fact fire the shots that killed Timothy Russell and Melissa. And I don't know that can be determined with any certainty. And to me, my takeaway is that the Attorney General, when he put his finger on the systemic breakdown of the police department, I mean, that's where the problem is. And I think what people take away from this trial is that the police need better training, they need better oversight, there needs to be more accountability. And we're not seeing that.
Pete?
Well, my final thought on this is just that, the police, they kind of embraced almost a bit of a mob mentality on this. And Brelo was the one who, I mean, you can't look at what he did in isolation. He was caught up in everything else that was going on. He's just the one that kind of took it to a little further. But if it wasn't for everybody else participating, he wasn't going to do what he did, I don't believe. So like I say, the officers, for whatever reason, that night, they kind of lost their heads. And I don't know if it's because of the individual police that were involved, whether it was systemic failure or on some other way, but they just were not acting the way they should when they conducted a pursuit.
Now, do you agree with Sharon and Kevin that this was probably a misbegotten prosecution to begin with? Given how many people were involved, 13 officers
Again, I think
fired their weapons.
I think it's going to be really hard to, again, if Brelo's guilty, then I think they're all kind of guilty of something, and that's, going at this in the way they did. I don't know. You always want to see. You hate it when nobody is charged and these things just kind of evaporate, and it's left with nothing but mistrust and ill will. You like to see some kind of closure, and I think that's what McGinty wanted to do, is try to put some kind of closure on this, and I give him credit for that. But it's tough, and whether the evidence is going to be there to convict him or not. Good question. I think it's similar in what's going on in Baltimore right now. I think there's a parallel there.
We carried an op-ed not that long ago from the lawyer of Mr. Henderson, who was a case that the Justice Department highlighted in their report because there was, unbeknownst to the officers, video taken from a helicopter as he was, beaten after he was, or beat up after he had already surrendered to police on a New Year's Eve. The point of the op-ed was that the Cleveland Police Patrolmen's Union bears some responsibility in making sure that officers come forward when there's a violation of a person's right. Do we think that message has been received by the Cleveland Police Union, or
No.
should it be received?
I think absolutely not. I think the way they see themselves is protecting their members at all costs, and that's unfortunate, but I think that's the way many unions approach these kind of issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a us versus them
They become like a
mentality.
defense lawyer as opposed to a seeker of truth.
Do you think that could change depending on how the Justice Department consent decree is negotiated and fashioned?
I hope so, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I hope so too. I mean, I think that's where you want to have everybody sitting at the table, and you want the union involved, because I still believe, and I may be naive, but 99% of the officers out there want to do the right thing.
Well, that's the
I
last
would agree.
word. we certainly want our police force to have good relations with the community and the adequate training and pay that they need. But we will wait and see what the Michael Brelo trial results in. Thank you for joining us. We'd like to hear your opinions about this in the comments, and we'll look for you next week. Thank you.